Our panel that we'll have next is Futures for Then, Futures for Now. And I'll introduce our speakers. Dr. Celeste Winston is an abolitionist geographer and assistant professor of geography and urban studies at Temple University. Her work is driven by her love and accountability for Black people and communities. She centers everyday Black life and placemaking practices as models for liberation. She aims to help build a more livable and equitable world by tracing legacies of Black alternative ways of living across space and time. Dr. Winston's first book, How to Lose the Hounds, Maroon Geographies in a World Beyond Policing, is a guide to police abolition, connecting slavery-era Black freedom struggles and modern efforts to build a world beyond policing. Amid rising calls for abolition, the book reveals long-standing ways to secure public safety and community well-being without police. Her presentation is titled On Fugitivity and Marronage, Grounding Metaphors for Black Abolitionist Futures. Dr. Olúfẹ Táíwò is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University. He received his PhD in philosophy at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has published in academic journals ranging from Public Affairs Quarterly, One Earth, Philosophical Papers, and Philosophy in the Black Experience. Táíwò's theoretical work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, anti-colonial thought, German transcendental philosophy, contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social science, and histories of activism and activist thinkers. His public philosophy, including articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism, has been featured in The New Yorker, The Nation, Boston Review, Slate, and Al Jazeera, among others. He is the author of 2 books, Elite Capture and Reconsidering Reparations. His presentation is titled Distributive Justice and Reconsidering Reparations. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Amani and Lydia, for organizing this, and all the folks who I haven't communicated with, but I'm sure had a lot of part to getting us all here together. So what I want to do in my time today is talk about 2 common metaphors in Black thought and culture, scholarship, and organizing, which are marronage and fugitivity. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the term marronage, it refers to the practice of flight from slavery, whereby Black people who were enslaved took their freedom into their own hands, fled from plantations, organized against slave patrols, and created worlds of freedom. And that kind of worlds of freedom is a really critical part of my work as a geographer. I argue that, and this actually echoes something from the plenary panel that we just listened to, that the kind of ephemeral Black placemaking that is really resonant in marronage was not just temporary, but it had lasting impacts. And a lot of my work dives into what are those lasting impacts. And then the concept of fugitivity. This is another metaphor that's really common in Black organizing. It's part of the kind of Fred Moten work that also came up in the panel, kind of how can we be fugitives in the university? That's often a metaphor, but it also refers to a really material practice whereby Black people do illegal acts, and often the kinds of creative acts that Black people take to ensure our freedom to survive and our world are deemed unlawful because we are living in the context of anti-Black structures whereby Black freedom and life are often criminalized in any kind of shape that they take place. And so what I want to do today is dive into these metaphors, really ground them in some particular Black geographies to argue that we can do more than understanding marronage and fugitivity as metaphor, and that in the work of grounding these metaphors, we actually have so many kind of possibilities for organizing and for theorizing and working towards real Black liberated futures. And so I have on this slide a list of synonyms that come up in the Black lexicon, be it in literature, folklore, music. This list was published in a book by Daryl Cumberdance in the 80s called Long Gone. And she argues that in the Black lexicon, there is no idea, no concept or metaphor that is more common than the idea of Black escape. And if you look at the metaphors or the phrases that I highlighted in green, you can see here that some are directly reminiscent of Marronage, the go north, the take it to the woods or the hills, tunneling or going into hiding, right? These are all directly referencing practices of Black flight from slavery. And then the other ones here that I've highlighted, things like jump bail, jump a train, go over the wall. These are also terms that are other kinds of Black fugitive actions. So you can see here the kind of bounty of metaphor and all of the kind of work that these theories can do at the level of metaphor. But then if we ground these metaphors, if we think about how Black flight, again, Marronage and fugitivity are deeply rooted in material geographies and histories, we're able to understand what did Black flight and fugitivity look like, right? In the era of slavery, that looked like Black people fleeing from plantations and in the process fleeing from slave patrols, which were the precursors of modern day police, pushing back against surveillance, also transforming swamps and mountains and forests and other kinds of ecologies into worlds of freedom. And then we can look to some of those same places. Again, even if the practices of flight and placemaking were temporary or weren't lasting beyond, generations, they had really lasting impacts. And we can find these in ways that Black people are pushing back against anti-Black violence today. So we can think about practices like land reclamation. We can think about mutual aid networks and alternative justice practices, and also really clearly fugitive practices like bench warrant avoidance and squatting as ways to understand how marronage is taking place today. And I actually just started some conversations with the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, because I'll get into my research in a couple of seconds, but I did my work in Montgomery County, Maryland. I'm from the DC area, so I came back home to do my research for the book that was just given away. And there's this group called the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition who is organizing for Black land reclamation in the very white, wealthy Montgomery County, specifically Bethesda. And so they're mobilizing using some of my research, understanding that marronage isn't just something that happened in the past, but that has had lasting impacts and can inform claims for Black land reclamation today. And so all of that then leads us to the kind of future imaginaries that we form. And I think in particular, marronage and fugitivity give us some really useful and powerful frameworks to understand that abolition isn't something that's just abstract, isn't something that we are starting from scratch, but in fact has been happening ever since the era of slavery and even before that. And we can understand really clearly some ways in which Black people for generations, for centuries, have been pushing back against borders, have been pushing back against police and other systems of confinement and control to be able to concretely argue for the possibility and the hopefully near reality of Black abolitionist futures. And that is the work that I did in my book, How to Lose the Hounds, Maroon Geographies, and a World Beyond Policing. So for this book, again, I came back to this area, Montgomery County, Maryland, and I chose to do my research there partly because I'm from here, and I think, research is extractive as always, but I think when you go and do work in a place that you have a connection, you're more likely to go back. You're more likely to try to make your work, put it into work, like making the working theories that we're all here talking about today actually happen. And then also, Montgomery County was the site of over 40 Black communities being founded by Black people between the late 1700s and the late 1800s by Black people who had either self-emancipated or been emancipated from slavery, or who in the generations after slavery was abolished, established communities. And so in my work, I call these communities maroon geographies, and I argue that the kinds of placemaking and community building that shaped the formation of these communities, all the way back to the 1790, has continued to animate Black abolitionist praxis today. And I write about different ways that Black people living here in Montgomery County for generations have practiced safety, have cared for each other in ways that preclude the need for police to be involved in their community life. And so what I want to do with a little bit of time I have left is talk about some of the kind of key lessons that came out of this work to really drive home the point that by grounding these metaphors, we're able to really get some concrete ideas for building Black abolitionist futures. So the first argument is simple, right? Is that police are escapable, right? We are taught that police are necessary for societies to function and for us to have any kind of sense of safety. But what maroon geographies from the era of slavery up until today tell us is that police are escapable, that in literally fleeing from police, right, we can understand a kind of possibility of what can happen in the space of not kind of buying into policing. But then there are also these more structural ways that maroon geographies embody a kind of escape from policing. And in Montgomery County's maroon geographies, I learned, for example, that residents had established phone lines where they would call each other and turn to each other as first responders when things went on in their communities. And they would decide how they were going to handle an issue and if they were going to involve police. And often they decided, no, they didn't need police. Also, on a structural level, in maroon geographies in Montgomery County, there were all kinds of alternative justice practices where community members would hold each other accountable, and they would figure out ways to heal from harm without turning to the criminal legal system. So both in the kind of literal sense, but also this more structural sense, we can understand the ways that police are escapable through turning to maroon geographies. Another key argument that I make in my work is that abolition requires alternative relationships to land that are rooted in communal care, both for the earth, but also for each other, who form our communities. And if we think about slavery era maroon geographies, this is really clear in the ways that maroons took to places like swamps or mountains, and they did practices like foraging and small scale farming. And they did that in order to take care of themselves, in order to ensure each other's freedom. And all of that was made possible in part by the fact that this land, like swamps, for example, were not considered worthy for incorporation or even possible for incorporation into the plantation economy. And so there's this really kind of extractive capitalist logic of land ownership and production that maroons are directly pushing back against and showing an alternative that's possible. And this carried on as well into more modern day maroon geography placemaking. So again, if we think about maroon geographies in Montgomery County, Maryland, some of the lessons that I found were that the kind of land that these communities were formed on also echoed the kinds of ways that slavery era maroon geographies necessitated a kind of pushing back against white capitalist logics of extraction. So in Montgomery County, a lot of the Black communities were built in places that were marshy. One community actually had been known as Snake's Den because there were so many snakes that ran through it. And Lincoln Park, which is one of the Black communities in Montgomery County, Maryland, that soil was really rocky, so it wasn't considered tenable for any kind of agricultural production. And that led to the formation of Black communities. And then, and like the connections are pretty amazing. I always just kind of get lost in my head to think about these things. But what ended up happening over generations was that the kind of land stewardship that was then possible in these places, the kind of smaller scale agriculture, the subsistence farming, the kind of communal house building, which was really free or affordable because it didn't exist within the kind of frameworks of white development, also enabled Black placemaking beyond police. So one of my favorite quotes from any of the interviews that I did for my book was from somebody who grew up in the Rockville Black community called Hayti. And he grew up in the 30s, the 1930s in this community. And I asked him in an interview if police patrolled his neighborhood when he was growing up. And he laughed at me and he just said, no, like they didn't patrol our neighborhood because they could not even get up the road. And so it's this kind of direct divestment and just abandonment by white capital that also creates a kind of condition of possibility for Black freedom and placemaking beyond policing. Then more generally, really something that Black communities, and this picture is from the Lincoln Park neighborhood in Rockville, Maryland. Something that these communities also just show is that to have an abolitionist world, to have a world without police and other kinds of structures of anti-Black and other violence, you have to push back against capitalism. And in these communities, I found so many kind of models for what pushing beyond capitalism looks like, be that mutual aid practices where people were growing their own produce and they'd share that with each other and all come together around their needs because they couldn't turn to the stores outside of their communities. This looked like people coming together and constructing dwellings from found or affordable materials and not abiding by the kind of zoning regulations that shaped development in Montgomery County. And all of that also was just kind of undergirded by all kinds of networks of care and support that existed in these communities. And I think it's really critical to turn to these kinds of models if we're thinking about abolition today, because increasingly we live in a time where people's basic needs for housing, economic security, healthcare, and other kinds of basic needs are unmet. And then that need that's being unmet is criminalized. And so we can understand here, thinking about these connections, how just meeting our needs, having these kind of alternative structures that push back against racial capitalism also creates conditions for challenging policing. And then the last lesson that I want to talk about, and I think it kind of gets at Danielle's question from the earlier session, which is that abolition is a process. There's a lot of harm that happens on the way to abolishing police and other kinds of structures. There are a lot of compromises that get made, um, and there's a lot of kind of warnings to be had in that. But there's also, I think, a kind of radical possibility that comes by accepting that abolition isn't an immediate emancipation. And if, again, we think about slavery era maroon geographies, these were liminal spaces between slavery and then a world without slavery. And then likewise today, maroon geographies are places that are liminal between a world that is a police state and then a world that we're working towards without police, right? And we can say that about borders, we can say that about prisons, we can say that about kind of the family structure that oppresses so many of us, gender, we can go on and on. And I think maroon geographies give us some lessons for thinking about abolition as a process in all of these kinds of ways. And the one example that I'll highlight from my work is in Lincoln Park, Maryland. In 2012, there was a police substation that was shut down in the community. And this happened because residents organized and asked for the Rockville City Police to turn over the police substation to the community. And the Rockville City Police agreed. And now it's that former substation is a tutoring and mentoring space for community youth that the police have no involvement in. At the same time, back in 2012, when this transformation happened, there was actually a new police headquarters that was opened up just outside of the Lincoln Park neighborhood and Rockville City proper. And so just in that, you can kind of see how progress that's made towards abolition, right? In Lincoln Park, we have this moment of opportunity where residents are able to reduce the surveillance and the presence of policing in their neighborhood at the same time that there is a increase of investment in police resources and infrastructure. So again, there's this process, but we can also understand that the kind of possibilities that come from understanding that, right? That there's this kind of liminal journey that we take from challenging state sovereignty, from challenging policing, from challenging other kinds of structures of violence. And we can also see that there's kind of incremental steps that are happening whereby we're reducing our reliance on policing, we're reducing some kind of investment in policing in a particular place. And therefore, we can understand that even in context of seeming impossibility, that there's some possibility still to be had. And so just to wrap up really quickly, I just want to reiterate that Marronage and Fugitivity are two metaphors that can do a lot when we ground them within the material contexts that they come from, right? If we think about, in particular, the work of abolition, it's so important to understand that the kind of frameworks, the theoretical frameworks that we're turning to actually are invitations to go deeper and to be able to find material connections between past Black resistance and organizing and the kinds of Black futures that we want to create. And in the spirit of the first panel, I have questions also to pose, which can come up. We can talk about these in the Q&A or over the hors d'oeuvres. But first, I'm curious if there's any metaphors that shape your work that you're kind of working through as you work to build towards Black futures. And then I want to think about how that metaphor functions really effectively at a theoretical or figurative level. But then also, the third question here is what kind of insights then come when grounding that metaphor within the concrete realities and lived experiences of Black people and places? Thank you.
Thanks to the department, to Amani and Lydia, and to our translators, and for everybody for showing up. I am going to try to say what I think follows up really nicely on Celeste's point. I think there's a real convergence around this idea of there's a concreteness, right, to the idea of world building. And I think we both have thought about that in different ways. And I'm going to come at it just from this angle: distributive justice and reparations. So distributive justice is usually something that philosophers talk about in connection to kind of way more boring theory about income distribution, right? They're just kind of counting numbers, right? Who has $80,000? Who's in the top 10% of income owners? Who's in the top 20%? And all that's relevant, obviously. But I'm not just thinking about counting dollars or counting net assets. I'm thinking way more like Celeste is thinking, right? Thinking about distributive justice as explaining what the world is like. And I thought about it for a few years, and I ended up here. I ended up thinking that reparations, I ended up defending a view of reparations that was about world making, about placemaking in the language that we're using today, you might say. And because I ended up thinking that, I started thinking about climate justice. And maybe it's more obvious these days as we face 30 feet hurricanes, what those ideas might have to do with each other, at least why someone might think that they have something to do with each other. Every year I talk about this, I get less and less clued into whether or not it makes sense to anyone else besides me in the particular way that I think of it. But many people have come to this conclusion and I just joined them. But what the view is this. One way to think about reparations is as a forward-looking project, right? The reason for it is backward-looking. It's the ignoble history that created our present. It's the history of slavery and colonialism and oppression and death and destruction that created our present. But the thing that we could try to accomplish with it might be forward-looking. It might be trying to build a certain kind of world. And the particular way that I've thought about that construction project is in terms of distribution. So who has to pony up what amount of labor, wealth, burdens, who has to take on what level of burdens for that construction process. I got there by thinking about history in a particular kind of way. So on the left, you see a report from the National Resource Defense Council. They note that if you looked around in 1983 and found toxic waste site, you would also, more often than not, find a place that was near where Latino or Black people lived. It's not because there's any inherent connection between being in one of those demographic groups and being near toxic waste, but there is a causal connection. There are decisions made about where to put waste. There are decisions made about what housing is going to be affordable. There's decisions made about where to put capital. And all those decisions have to do with the general patterns of history that we could find in lots of other contexts. So I just generalize across these. We could call it racial capitalism. We could call it global racial empire. We could call it transatlantic slavery and colonialism. But whatever the world is on a planetary scale, it tends to distribute the nice things, not where Latino and Black Americans live. The wealth, the political power, the institutional connections, the research concentration tends to go in the direction of the global north and racially dominant communities, white communities, for instance. Disadvantages go the other way. And you see that at multiple scales, whether we're looking within the United States, whether we're looking across countries, so on and so forth. So the view I came to was that that system is the thing we should be trying to fix. That's the target for reparations. And some people agree with me, some people don't, but that's the view. But in the time that I have today, I want to try to say more directly with less weird arrows and letters why I would have a view like this, what there is to say for it. And I haven't been able to find a more direct way to say it than to point out New Orleans. So as many of us know, you might even remember, depending on how old you are, there was a major hurricane, Hurricane Katrina. It caused incredible amount of damage to lives, people, ecosystems, and infrastructure in New Orleans. And one of the things it caused damage to was the tree canopy of the city. Now, I didn't start thinking about climate justice because I just love plants. I do now, but when I started, I wasn't an environmentalist by nature. I wasn't trying to figure out, I wasn't looking for a connection between environmental problems and racial justice. But it turns out there is one. Right. So the lack of tree canopy, and in particular, which neighborhoods lack tree canopy, tend to track race and class. Poorer, blacker neighborhoods have fewer trees. And that doesn't just mean that they have fewer nice trees to look at, which is, I think, important in and of itself. But it means that when things get hot, as they increasingly will over the coming decades, there can be as much as a nearly 20-degree difference in where the heat is distributed across the city. And if you sit that next to where blackouts tend to be distributed across the city, that means that there's going to be a stark difference in the vulnerability to death from heat waves. Another thing to say along the same lines is to point out that Hurricane Katrina represented not just a change to the physical infrastructure of the city, but also to its political infrastructure. So as the New Orleans Tribune explains, there was a wide-scale set of changes to the education system in the aftermath of the hurricane. And some people who wanted, let's say, a less than equitable education system found themselves in a position to significantly change how education was delivered to young people in New Orleans. All of that is to say this. When I think about climate change, and I'm joining a lot of people in this, I do think about the ecology. But as a political philosopher, I just have the hammer. So everything is a nail. Everything is going to be a distributive problem for me. How is political power distributed? How is the heat distributed? All of these things have to do with politics. So we could focus on emissions, we could focus on temperature, we could focus on the level of the sea, and all of those have their place in climate politics. But for me, the global political distribution system is the climate crisis. I'm at least going to try out that oversimplification. So if you oversimplify it that way, if you focused on the political system rather than carbon emissions or temperature emissions, what kind of stuff might you notice? Stuff like this, I think. So some colleagues and I ran some numbers, and there is a climate change vulnerability index, and the colonized section of the world and the colonizer section of the world, let's say, face very starkly different climate realities. The safe countries are the ones on the colonizer side of the ledger, and the vulnerable ones on the other side. If you compare that to vulnerability within communities or within countries, you find the same things. Just as Latino and Black Americans were more likely to be cited next to toxic waste, just as Blacker, poorer communities in New Orleans are more vulnerable to heat waves. In general, you find climate vulnerability is higher for Blacker people, whether you're comparing them to their neighbors within the same country or across countries. Okay, let's go here. All I want to conclude this particular section by saying is that that too is redistribution. What reparations would be redistribution in the direction of justice. The people who have been historically plundered getting some distribution in their direction from richer parts of the world that have been enriched by the negative history. What we're getting instead, what the climate crisis represents, is the exact opposite direction. What the climate crisis represents is not just hurricanes and floods and heat waves, but the possibility to convert that into deepening injustice of the very normal kinds. Which people are going to die, which people are going to be incarcerated, which people face mass deportation, on the basis of how all of these problems with weather affect problems with politics. Okay, so that's the bad news. Is there good news? I think so. I think the Tribune thinks so as well. So in the very same sections I quoted earlier, they noted that the destruction wrought by the hurricane was an opportunity not just for the people organizing to shift education to the right, but it could have been to build, say, first-rate facilities that were publicly accessible for everyone. I think this perspective comes from thinking about place as the determining factor for politics, just as Celeste was explaining, right? Thinking about abolitionist possibilities as real concrete possibilities, and taking the political tradition of doing that in various generations of Black freedom struggle as giving us some ideas. I think our practical environment largely decides outcomes. I'm gonna run through these very quickly. I'm happy to talk more about them in Q&A. But social scientists have spent a lot of time trying to pretend that this is not true. On the right side of the screen, you see a long quote from a mea culpa of the researchers who helped popularize the idea of nudges, right? So if you put the carrots in the middle of the vending machine and put the Doritos on top, maybe people will make healthier decisions, that kind of social science. And that was maybe not the fairest explanation, but hopefully you know what I'm getting at there. But if we made more sweeping changes to people's ecology, if we didn't just change these small options of the decision environment, but we changed structurally whether or not we have single payer healthcare, for instance, if we make bigger ecological shifts, if we change people's lives in the direction of justice, we can make much larger kinds of changes. Literally, in this case, thousands and thousands of dollars more significant of changes to people's lives. And it turns out that if you take an ecological perspective, you can start plotting out very concrete ways to do this. So Dr. Gina South tried out ecological intervention where she led a group of researchers to do trash cleanup and greening, planting trees. And it turned out that not only did the place look nice because it's got trees now, but gun violence went down significantly. And if we made high-scale investments in improving the lives of people, we would find that that place-based perspective changes quite a bit. It's not just trees. We could change the literal visual appearance of places by cleaning up trash, by putting up streetlights. We could change the economic aspects of place making. We could provide summer jobs for people. But all of these things do the work that right now we're relying on police to do. It turns out that jobs programs do the thing we're asking cops to do. So if we like broken windows theory so much, maybe we should fix some windows. All right. So how do we fix windows on a bigger scale? Just the same kind of thinking, but we could do it on a global scale. We could have a global basic income, or we could send large amounts of money to climate vulnerable countries and do some placemaking investment that way. I'll just briefly mention that there's a new report out on doing this in the Caribbean. If we say canceled a bunch of debt, we might find that we'd made a difference to the decision-making environment in the Caribbean that was at the right scale to do something about the climate crisis and not depend on the global north for doing so. But I want to end by saying something that's a little more locally tractable by thinking about redistributing political power. And one of the things that's not up here, but I think is helpful to think about, is an idea in union organizing called bargaining for the common good. One example of this is Chicago Teachers Union, which is currently a Black-led union that has built a mass of political power in Chicago and used its leverage as workers to explicitly fight for placemaking, to explicitly fight for a vision of what Chicago is going to be, including but also beyond their workplaces. And that kind of political power can change a lot of things about a place. Thank you.
Thank you to you both. And we have about 15 minutes for our Q&A. So I will just ask you all one question and then I'll open it up to everyone else in the time that we have left. So, I'll ask a question that maybe you all might be able to answer briefly. Celeste, you talk about abolition, police abolition in particular, and then you talk about reparations. I know that sometimes people shut down when certain words are introduced and sound too radical. So my question to you both is, in the process toward abolition and realized forms of reparations, what do we do about those in our communities who might resist or dismiss these ideals, in part due to their terminology, but maybe also in part of the investment or connection to familiarity, even in light of the ways that it's not necessarily doing any of us any good?
Not on. Now it is. Okay. Yeah. So I actually walk into the familiarity when I try to get people to think about the possibility of police abolition. I ask people, have you called the police, or how often have you? Because often people aren't calling the police that much, right? And I try to get people to think about moments where they could have called the police, but they didn't, or times when police did get involved and how little help they offered, because they don't do much except for harm. And so I try to get people to think about ways that in their everyday life, abolition already exists in some kind of way. And then I try to also get them to think about communities like Black communities or immigrant communities, queer communities, where policing is just so violent and doesn't really offer any possibility of safety to help people understand the importance of abolition. And I think I like the radical term of abolition. I think, we saw what happened when people started arguing for defunding the police and people were saying, no, it doesn't mean actually get rid of the police. It just means, just take a little bit off their budgets, put a little bit towards community safety measures and whatnot. And so I think by moving away from the real demand, that concrete language, you end up losing something. And so I think you can do both, like bring people in, familiarity, and then also hit them with this is actually abolition.
Yeah, I think something pretty similar. I think especially for people who are organizers or movement affiliated, it's helpful to have a term that connects very different struggles, right? Because you may not win every person on every specific demand. But outside of that, I think it's often, at least in the case of reparations, I often just find myself talking about specific construction projects. Like I don't try to win people on like, yeah, you start talking about global racial empire, you sound like an alien. Like just, do you want kids in Chicago? Do you want Black kids in Chicago to have more or less counselors? Because that's what Chicago Teachers Union is fighting for, right? And, we don't have to agree on how that relates to monetary policy in the Spanish Empire in the 16th century to like be on the same page about whether or not we're going to fight for it here now. And if we can get people on board with each individual specific political program and they see how transformative it is, then there might be space for a larger conversation on the backside of that.
Thank you. I want to open it up to our audience. If anyone has any questions, we will pass the mic to you.
Hi, I have a question about the case for reparations. And Olúfẹ, I mean, it struck me that you're making quite a maximalist case, right? Which involves quite a lot of things. But I just wanted to ask how that way of making the case relates to a fairly minimalist one, which is just, if I take something from you, I have to give it back. And if I say, what good things are you going to do with it? How are you going to help lots of other people with what I just took from you? The right answer is, I don't have to tell you anything about that. All you need to know, it was wrong to take it. So how do you think about the maximalist version of reparations that you are giving versus kind of basic minimalist version that's just grounded in ideas of fairness?
So I think the minimalist version is going to give you a compelling account of, say, why the British Museum should return everything in the British Museum. It's going to be a harder sell for why Barclays Bank should give up part of its assets, right? So I think, you're trading a kind of clean-cut story for a much more limited domain, at least, more limited than I would care for, right? So I think, I'm steering towards the maximalist vision because I want to call into question wealth in general and capitalism in general, and not just, specific items. Though, give back the Benin bronzes, why not? But
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I just wanted to know where does the state fit into sort of horizons of abolition and where not?
I don't think there's one right answer to this. In my work, I write about ways that Black communities have negotiated with the state in ways that create some kind of possibility for building safety without police, like that Lincoln Park substation example. Like it is a detachment to a community center in that neighborhood in Rockville, and it's funded by the state still. But now you have this state investment and a non-police resource that's really helping the community and is really pushing back against other kinds of visions of policing that had married youth education with policing in Montgomery County, Maryland, and many places. There have been initiatives where the police are brought in as tutors for, neighborhood kids as a way to build up residents' trust in police and establish a heightened presence of policing. But here we have a reliance on the state, but in a way that's kind of remixing things and reducing police power. So I think it's possible to have a kind of state approach towards abolition. And in my work, I write about kind of the paradox of abolition policy, since policy and it's that its root word literally shares the root of police. And so I think it's complicated, but I don't know if we need to, or even if we can, get to abolition without some kind of negotiations with the state, at least at this point.
So I'll just say historically, there was at least a demand by most for the state to be part of negotiations in the sense of withdrawing. So like the Republic of New Africa said, the US government should cede its control over territory so that we can negotiate with indigenous people for what to do with this land. And, whatever critiques the Republic of New Africa might deserve, I think there's a wisdom to that element of what they were thinking. But in the 21st century, I think we have to have a ruthlessly practical relationship to the state, because the competitors to the state certainly include, the communities fighting for autonomy and justice, but they also include asset managers and the United States of Bezosistan. And if the state withdraws from somewhere, I like Elon Musk's chances better than ours for taking over what's been withdrawn from. So I think that's a strategic problem that we have to face head on.
I was wondering, in the abolition of the policing and as well as our approach to some of these reconsiderations, where does policy and what are you pushing for? Or where can we push and help with getting policy to drive this engine?
Yeah. I have a lot of ideas here. I'm trying to make it short. I think like some of the arguments that I make in my work is that you can take these community-based alternatives to policing and the kinds of investments in free and affordable housing or subsistence agriculture, mutual aid, and put the state's resources towards that. So it's this kind of argument, a kind of a reparation argument, I think, for being able to say, look, the state has a really immense capacity and amount of resources that is unmatched, really. And we can kind of take advantage of that and be able to build out and resource the underinvested ways that people are already building safety without police. And do it in a way that doesn't compromise the kinds of values that these communities are already doing. Because we've seen that happen, like if in the kinds of youth court systems where youth are brought together to mediate conflict, but it's deeply enmeshed in the criminal legal system. So there's mistakes that we can learn from, but I think there's a lot of possibilities there. The work that I sort of mentioned with the Bethesda Africa Cemetery Coalition right now has been really interesting to me to think about too on the kind of policy level, because this group is organizing for Black land reclamation in Bethesda. There was this community that had been demolished in the early 20th century, and there was a cemetery and that has no grave markers. And there's a lot of development that's happening throughout the DMV, but specifically on this land. And so the coalition right now is working to push back against the Maryland State Capital Planning Association. I think it's a lot of words, but I think that's the name of that group. And so I was actually able to kind of go through all of my archival images and find all of these references to ways that planning association had decimated Black communities, and they're using that to make a case for reparations again, and say, look, this is a systematic practice of Black community erasure, and this isn't just some isolated development scheme, and here's the evidence. So I think right, again, in terms of policy, there's a lot that I think can be done by kind of treating the archives of the state as almost like a repository for Black anti-Blackness, and then be able to kind of push for the kind of policies that can now hopefully give us some kind of repair.
Yeah, and I would just add quickly, in the policy universe, the thing that I'm thinking more about is trying to get more direct democratic control over policy as a policy issue. There are ways for direct democratic decision-making, participatory budgeting, like they started in Brazil, citizens assemblies as a lawmaking function. You know, I think it'll be difficult to convince, you know, every single one of our neighbors of the wisdom of abolishing the police. But I think it would be much easier to do that than to convince city council or, you know, elected officials who have to run for office. So I think that's a place to spend some time thinking about.
All right, we are out of time for this session. Please join me in thanking our panelists.